Recording. It's recording.
Yep, thanks. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the NLG seminar. Today we have Amita Kamath. Amita is a PhD candidate in computer science, co-advised by Kaiwen Chang at UCLA and Ranjay Krishna at the University of Washington. She frequently collaborates with the Allen Institute for AI2. Previously, Amita was a pre-doctoral young investigator at AI2, where she worked with the prior team on general purpose vision language systems. Before that, she completed her MS in computer science at Stanford University, where she worked with Percy Liang's group on distribution shift and NLP. She has published papers at top NLP and CV conferences such as EMNLP and CBPR. Amita, all yours.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to share my work today, titled Scale Can't Overcome Pragmatics, the Impact of Reporting Bias on Vision Language Reasoning. From all of your introductions a little earlier, it sounds like more of you are on the language side, so I'll try to pitch my talk accordingly. It's really interesting to see the kinds of biases that crop up in language and how they kind of leak through our pre-training data into what our models are capable of, whether that's in language or in vision language, which is what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so this is work joined with Jack, Khyati, Jenna, Kaiwei, and Ranjay, who are at UW, UCLA, AI2, Mistral, and Samaya. Feel free to jump in at any point of time if you got questions, and yeah, let's get started. Okay, so just like kind of a snapshot of vision language research, right? We see that models are getting better and better. This is just any screenshot from any paper that you see these days, and it's got really good performance. This is actually Lava One Vision. It's got really good performance across a very wide variety of benchmarks. You've got everything from science to math to real world question answers, that kind of thing. At the same time, though, these models can still fail at basic reasoning. For example, earlier this year, I asked Lava, is the mug on the table? For this picture of a mug that is clearly under a table. And it says, yes, the mug is sitting on the table. And you follow up with, is the mug under the table? It says, no, the mug is not under the table. It is sitting on top of the table. Similarly, if you ask Clip, and I know, Clip isn't perfect, but even so, if you ask Clip, like before this, did the man pick up the payphone? And you give it options of yes and no, it's going to give a higher probability to no conditioned on this image. So this very basic types of reasoning is still kind of a problem for these models. Now, the question, of course, is why does this happen, right? And there are kind of different schools of thought, and people from these schools of thought have different fixes to this problem. Now, there's one group of people that says, oh, in contrastive models, the image text matching pre-training task relies too much on batch size to teach your models like fine-grained visual understanding. And these folks come up with different types of hard negatives to improve visual understanding of contrastive models like Clip. On the other hand, you have some people who are saying, oh, image level captions are insufficient supervision. And they introduce different losses, maybe losses that include bounding box information and stuff like that, region captions, to further supervise our models. But no one is really looking at the data that these models are trained on. And that's kind of where we come in. Let's think about the kind of data that our models are trained on. What data have we been using? We started out with conceptual captions, 3 million. We moved on to web image text, 400 million, then Leon, 5 billion. And you can see that the scale is increasing and increasing and increasing, right? We're trying to train on everything we possibly can. But at the end of the day, who is writing these captions? It's people, and you might say like, oh, if only there was a field of study about how people communicate via language. Right? And of course, that's linguistics. So obviously a long-standing field of study that really focuses on the patterns and idiosyncrasies and the cultures behind language. So if our question is how do people write captions, then we can leverage this whole body of known work to point out gaps in the data that we are training our models on. So we're going to argue that many limitations of vision language model reasoning stem from a reporting bias in the training data. Now, reporting bias is, traditionally defined as the selective revealing or suppression of information by subjects, or subjects' tendency to underreport all of the information available. Now, this presented itself in NLP as the common sense problem, right? Like the bigram people murder is just more likely to appear in text than people breathe, because of course people breathe. You don't have to say that, right? And there's a lot of very interesting work in the NLP space, some of which I've cited here, about how do you make sure that just because people murder as a bigram is more likely to appear in text than people breathe, it doesn't mean that people murder is more likely to happen than people breathe, right? In the model's understanding. So the question is, what does this look like in vision language, right? Where you can argue that for a given image, there is a ground truth because the ground truth is, what's seen in the image. But yeah, how would reporting bias crop up there? So our research question is how people caption pictures in web scale image text corpora and how what they do and don't say in these captions impacts what models do and don't learn when trained on them. Okay. Further, we're going to argue that if we don't understand the human behaviors that go into creating the data we train on, then scale alone is not going to solve all of our problems. It's quite common these days to like scale up and scale up and scale up, whether it's your model parameters, whether it's your data. And we have been seeing like improvements, right? Otherwise people wouldn't be doing it. But we're going to show you that in the case of reasoning, you may be able to count on scale for the emergence of recognition, like ImageNet kind of tasks, but not for the emergence of reasoning. Okay, do we have any questions so far? Okay, so what we're going to do in this work is first come up with hypotheses based on linguistics, pragmatics, and related fields about what people don't say when captioning images. And then we're going to look into open source web scale image text corpora like Leon, for example, and test these hypotheses. Are we right? Are we wrong? Okay, so the first part. The question is, what do people leave out of captions and why, right? Now, there's some preliminaries that probably most of you are familiar with, but I'll go through quickly just in case. The first preliminary that you need to know from like linguistics, pragmatics is Gricean maxims, okay? Now, these are rules that kind of govern how people speak, how they interact with each other through language. And these aren't things that you need to know consciously. These are, maxims that just emerge in communication, and you can kind of like neatly box them into some categories. The first Gricean maxim is the maxim of quality, okay, which says be truthful. When people speak, they tend to be truthful. They don't give false or unsupported information. The second one is quantity. Say enough information, but not too much. And we'll have some examples of this later on. Next is relevant. Stay relevant to the topic of discussion. And finally, manner, the maxim of manner, which says be clear, avoid ambiguity. Okay, if you want to convey a point to a person, you want to be truthful, you want to be concise, you want to be relevant, and you want to be unambiguous. The second preliminary and the last one is the Rational Speech Act. I'm not going to go too much into detail, but the point is you imagine, or not imagine, you assume that you are a rational speaker speaking to a rational listener. And you ask, what is the least amount of information I need to convey to get my point across? Which of course is conditioned very heavily on what does the other person already know, right? If I'm speaking to my mom about the research I'm doing, I would speak in a very different way than if I'm speaking to you guys about the research that I'm doing, because I'm assuming different like information that both of you have. Okay, so these are the preliminaries. And now we're going to go into the hypotheses of what people leave out of image captions and why. So the first hypothesis is that people tend to omit spatial language. Let's say, for example, you've got this image. You're probably going to caption it like a dog and a cat rather than, a cat to the right of a dog. And why, right? Like the first thing is if you caption it a cat to the right of a dog, instead of just a cat and a dog, the first maxim that you break is the maxim of quality, which says be truthful. Now, if I'm saying a cat to the right of a dog, why am I assigning more importance to one over the other by grounding one object with respect to the other, right? There must be some reason. And if there's no reason, I won't do it. The second one is the maxim of manner, which says avoid ambiguity. If I say cat to the right of a dog, who's right? Is it the dog's right, or is it my right as the viewer of this image? Last one is the maxim of relevance, stay relevant. Like in what scenario would the relative positions even matter, right? Like for most like intents and purposes, if I'm trying to convey to you what's in this image, it's enough if I say a cat and a dog. Okay, second hypothesis, people tend to omit temporal language. So for example, you've got this picture, probably you're going to say a person throwing a ball and not a person throwing a ball after which the ball is going to fall down, okay? This breaks the maximum of quantity, right? It's unnecessary to add that information. It's longer than you need because the person already knows it, right? Again, coming to the Rational Speech Act, what does the other person already know? Like these things are assumed to be obvious. It's the same as in NLP, like people breathe. Yeah, of course people breathe. Or they're throwing a ball, of course it's going to fall down because of gravity, right? Like everybody knows this. So you see that this kind of behavior probably is going to be omitted when people are captioning images. Third hypothesis, people tend to omit counting. You got a picture of a bunch of cute puppies and you're going to say, yeah, a group of puppies. You're not going to count and say, oh, there's exactly 7 puppies. Because again, it's less effort to say a group of than to count and say exactly how many. It's not really relevant. Like in what scenario does it really matter exactly how many puppies there are? Like if it's 6, if it's 7, like it's still a group. And that's, for most intents and purposes, what you care about. And then the Rational Speech Act, again, there's minimum delta in information conveyed by saying 7 puppies over saying a group of puppies in most contexts that you can imagine. Now, surely there's some contexts in which the exact number matters. But by and large, when you're captioning images on the internet, it doesn't tend to. Do we have a question?
Yeah, I think this one I disagree with you on, but I think there's a number at which I would agree with you. And I think there's a number at which you would disagree with you, right? Like if there were 2 puppies, probably 2 puppies would be okay. And possibly 3, right? And I would say 7, and I probably would say 8, and after that I might not count. And I'm wondering if, I don't know, I guess a lot of this also kind of matters on the instructions. Do you have an assumption here about like the way that captioning is being instructed?
Yes, I will get into that. That's like a really big chunk of our argument. And I totally agree with you. I think what this should say in full is people tend to omit counting, especially at higher counts. Now, if you look at the actual data, which I'll go into in a bit, I don't think I have the specific figure, but people say 2 and 3 all the time. People say 4 a little less, and you get this very steep drop. People don't want to count. And again, it depends on the annotated instructions, which again, I will get to. But by and large, you see, if you just scrape data from the internet, you see the steep fall. When you look at benchmarks, which are also scraped from the internet, they also have this steep fall. I believe Count QA, if I'm not wrong, it just samples. So you've got this very unbalanced distribution. And it's only when you go to different benchmarks like Count Bench, I believe it's called, which actually has like this nice balance of the same number of counts, or same representation of each count rather. So yeah, I agree with you completely. And I'll get into the instructions in a bit. Do we have any other questions? Okay, and the last hypothesis is that people tend to omit negations, yeah? So you're going to look at this picture and you're going to say, oh, it's a picture of an orange cat. You're not going to say a cat that is orange and not black, or it's even unlikely you're going to say a cat that is not black. Because again, a cat that is orange and not black is extra speech than is required. It's obvious that the cat is not black if it's orange. There's no additional information conveyed, again, same point. Quality, it falsely implies that there's a reason to specify that the cat is not black. Right? Like if I'm saying this cat is orange and not black, probably you're going to assume, oh, maybe this person is like superstitious and they have some problem with black cats. And that's why they're specifying, oh, like really, it's not black. And if that implicator is false, like if there is no extra reason, then there's no need to put this in. And then even if you go back to like concepts of language acquisition or psycholinguistics, negations are just harder for the brain to process. Kids pick them up later in life compared to affirmative facts. So for all of these reasons, people don't tend to add negations to the caption. Okay, so we've come up with a bunch of hypotheses. I talked to you a lot about what are the things that people probably don't say and why they probably don't say them. But now we're actually going to look into open source web scale image text corpora to test these hypotheses. So the data sets that we're looking at are Leon, which is just straight from the internet. We're looking at Coco, which is much smaller, but was, you asked annotators for annotations. There's Lava, the training data, which is a combination of like some web scrape data, some like annotated data, some synthesized data, and Malmo, which is similar. Okay, and what do you see if we have done a keyword search in this case? And we say, okay, for spatial, we're going to look at left of, right of, and a couple of like keywords. For counting, 1, 2, 3, and so on. For negations, like a couple of negations, and same for temporal, before, after. And we see that the occurrences themselves are low, But when you try to guess the true occurrences, and I'll go into how this is guessed in the next slide, they are really low, okay, except maybe for counting, for which it's a little higher. To put these percentages in perspective, the word blue alone appears in almost 2% of lay-on caption, and it's usually very clearly visible in the image, blue sky, blue shoes. In comparison, all the prepositions together, on, under, left, right, and so on, together are 0.1% of the data. So you would imagine that it's much easier to pick up a concept like blue, which appears in 2 out of 100 captions, compared to the left and right, which appear in very, very small fractions. Yeah, question.
So I guess I have a question on some of these, right? We look at the categories and we can track words related to those categories, but how do we know that, I guess, a sense of whether it should have been there? I get that spatial and negation, you can always come up with stuff, but specifically with stuff like counting, right? Like, do we have a sense of, and this is hard, right? Like, what if you were giving attention to counting, how different the data would look post annotation?
Great question. I will get to that all the way at the end of this talk, in which we do actually a controlled study of saying for the same images, and this actually goes back to John's question earlier, if you had like different instructions, how would you annotate it differently? And we see quite a significant gap. Okay, so I guess the takeaway from this slide is just people don't talk about these things. Now it's possible that we're missing a lot of things because of our keyword search being like maybe too specific. I can say that I've sampled a lot of the data. It seems that we get decent coverage. And what we see is that when we actually look at how, these things occur, we can actually trace it very nicely to the models trained on this data. How well do they do? So I said an estimated true occurrence, right? And specifically what that means is we sample 100 data points for each keyword, and we check how many of them actually operationalize the type of reasoning, okay? So in the previous slide, I said, 0.3% of the data has, for example, the word under for spatial, right? But maybe this could be like, t-shirts under $10, and that doesn't actually operationalize spatial reasoning. So that's something that is dropped out, and that's the delta between this column of occurrence and estimated true occurrence. So for example, under a dense forest canopy versus under $5,000, counting like set of 2, yeah, there's 2 curtains in there. But if it's 8 by 12-inch painting, no, that's not really counting, right? So that's kind of how we're getting those numbers from the previous slide. So it's quite clear that this reporting bias that we're seeing, like, people don't tend to do this, they don't tend to do that, does impact what reasoning-related data ends up in our corpora, okay? But the question is it really a problem? And this gets back at the questions that some of you have asked so far. Because maybe, okay, so the question is, how does occurrence affect model reasoning? Just because the occurrence is low doesn't mean that models do poorly. It's possible that they can learn reasoning from fewer instances, or from data that operationalizes these types of reasoning but wasn't caught in our keyword search, right? For all the stuff that we might miss, maybe that's something that actually teaches the model. One very good example of this is the word background. Now, it's very often to say, this is something, and in the background, there's something else. And technically, you can think of it as that being something behind something else. Now, we don't have to worry about this in our specific project because we don't evaluate the model for behind reasoning. But it is something to think about that, maybe there is, something like a type of data that we're missing that does operationalize the concept that we care about. So how we're going to check is we're going to evaluate both contrastive and generative models on these types of reasoning. And then we're going to do that check like, does it really make a difference? So for spatial, negation, temporal, and counting, this is kind of what the benchmark looks like. We've got like different types of images, and for each of these, we've got a contrastive evaluation, which is this kind of like you've got different options of captions, and the model has to give a probability to each one independently, and then you pick whichever one is maximum. For spatial and negation, you've got 4 options. For temporal, you've got 2, which is before and after. And for counting, you've got 9 options between 2 and 10. And then the generative evaluation, which, we tried something in the contrastive style for generative models, but it didn't seem fair and it didn't make sense. So we do give it to them as a multiple choice question. Now, technically, this isn't exactly comparable to the contrastive model, which only sees 1 option at a time. But it is the kind of, you're allowing each type of model to shine where it shines best. And we're going to compare those evaluations. So for spatial negation temporal, again, multiple choice. For counting, we did try the multiple choice approach, but all of our models, like all of them, did much better when they could actually just answer with the number. So that's how we evaluate those. Okay, so results. We've got a bunch of models all evaluated on these 4 benchmarks. And you can say kind of like off the bat, contrastive models do poorly. Most of them are slightly above random chance, except negations, which is far, far below random chance. And what you actually see is that CLIP and similar models, they just ignore the negation entirely, which is not surprising at all, because again, it's not something that it was forced to pay attention to by the training setup. So they ignore the negation and then they get it wrong. These models also seem to be quite good at counting, which is a little surprising to us. But we do see that counting data appears more often in their training. There's a point about multilingual diversity, which I'm actually going to skip for now and get to in another couple slides. When you look at open source generative models like Lava and Molmu, they do better than the contrastive models, but they're not perfect. There's a large gap between how these models do and the human estimate, which is literally 100, 100, 100. Like it's so easy for you to look at like 2 zebras, very clearly 2 zebras, and say, yeah, they're 2 zebras. There's no occlusion, there's no, that sort of thing. Molmu does better than Lava, which is interesting to us because, this work is affiliated with AI2, which came out with Molmu. Some closed source generative models do well, except at negations, on which everyone's doing pretty badly. But it's not clear why, right? Like this whole study is trying to say, oh, what do we know about our training data that tells us about how our models are going to do? We unfortunately can't really say much about any of these models because we have no idea what they're trained on. And in some cases, we have a general sense of what they're trained on, but we don't actually have the data to do these analyses over. Okay, so this is the point about multilingual diversity, which I raised earlier. Does adding information from different languages help? Okay, let's talk about multilingual diversity, and this goes back to the point mentioned earlier today about like translating between different languages, right? So people who speak different languages communicate about images differently. Now, there's a really cool paper I've cited here, which shows that for the same image, a Japanese speaker is going to say, oh, there's a man sitting in a room, and there's several tables filled with luggage nearby. Whereas an English speaker would say, oh, several suitcases leaned on a large table, several backpacks on top. They didn't even mention the person. So there's clearly like a big gap, or rather like there is a set difference, I suppose, between what people who speak different languages convey about the image. And there are studies about this again in this paper that show, oh, maybe people from Eastern cultures take a more holistic view of the image or more event-centric compared to person-centric, and maybe like, Western speakers do the opposite. Yeah, I'd highly recommend taking a look at this paper. And follow-up work from, a set of those same authors showed that you can actually very concretely operationalize this. In terms of multilingual diversity, what do you get by adding data from different languages and translating them into English? You get concepts that are not in the English distribution. For example, this type of bird that's primarily found in Japan is going to be talked about more in Japanese captions than in English captions. Even words that do appear in English, for example, stove, stuvs in English-speaking countries look different than stuvs in non-English speaking countries or in countries that speak other languages as well. So you get this nice distribution of even the same word, what else can it look like? So they've shown that it improves ImageNet retrieval, which is very surprising to me because ImageNet by and large is, very concrete stuff like, an octopus. And I can't imagine that an octopus would look so different if you have this multilingual diversity mixed in compared to like looking at retrieval for like, long tail distribution. But it's still very interesting that this kind of thing helps. I think there's a lot of scope. But our question is there something that everyone misses? Are the Gricean maxims unique only to English, or is this kind of something that does crop up in other languages? So this is CLIP VITB32. Those are the numbers that it's getting on our benchmark. And when you take the CLIP model trained on this multilingual diversity data, which again has been like translated into English, it doesn't do better. On most of the things, it just does worse. So, it doesn't improve performance. So it does seem that there is something that everyone misses. And if you actually take a look at the data, again, people don't, use negations. People don't use counting, stuff like that. So again, it's not like too surprising, but there is one important caveat here that I do want to mention, which is contrastive models like CLIP are not great at paying attention to every single word in the caption. I said this earlier when I said CLIP is like ignoring the negation word. Similarly here, it can, maybe the information is captured there, but CLIP is just ignoring it. It's possible. You could imagine training a generative model on this multilingual diversity data, but that's not something we got around to in this project. Okay, now coming to an interesting question. Can you scale this problem away? Right? I said right in the beginning of this talk that scale has worked really well for a lot of different problems. What about this one? So let's look at some scaling laws. Now, this is lifted again from existing work. I haven't cited them here, but it's a paper. I forget exactly what it's called, but I can send it over later if you'd like. And the idea is that as you scale up the compute, okay, whether that's measured in the number of data points or the times you're seeing each data point or the model parameters, you just multiply all of those. The ImageNet error rate drops significantly, right? It's going from like 40s to like lower 20s. So great, scaling helps on ImageNet. Now let's look at our benchmark. Okay, so we're going to evaluate CLIP on our benchmarks. So yeah, okay, scaling does really well for ImageNet. This is our spatial reasoning benchmark. Okay, and as you scale up and up and up, there is no indication whatsoever that the model is getting better. In fact, it kind of seems to be getting worse. Remember that like this is the error rate, so you want to be low on this graph. So okay, clearly like scaling, at least for CLIP, does not help with spatial reasoning. For counting, we do actually see this nice kind of drop in error. And I mentioned earlier too as well that CLIP seems to do well on counting. So that's cool. For negations, you do see kind of a downward trend, but if you actually look at the y-axis, it's like maybe a 2-point drop or a 3-point drop. Like these models are getting a tiny bit better, but you would have to scale like an intractable, amount of data or parameters to actually reach human performance, which let me remind you is 0 error. Like for example, that cat, it's orange, it's not black. That's so trivial for people, right? Okay, and then finally temporal. Again, you're not seeing a very clear trend here. It looks like scale doesn't actually help much. So again, whether you scale the data, the parameters, this is data and parameters, but we've also got in the paper like data separately, parameters separately, and you see that it like neither of them helps. Question?
Yeah, can you explain the x-axis? What does total compute GMAC per sample times sample C mean?
Yeah. So GMAC per sample is effectively something like the number of parameters in the model. So you're saying, okay, how many parameters does my model have times sample seen? And sample seen is like that incorporates the data size, but also how many passes you're making through the data. So you can kind of, if you look at the legend here, you've got a sample seen is like the size of the blot. And either it's 3 billion or 13 billion or 34 billion. And the shape is what tells you whether it was like how much unique data it was trained on. So yeah, that's kind of a combination of these factors, which results in that x-axis.
So different from the language models, then, is it appropriate to say? So I'm speaking a little bit without really knowing here, but like I'm under the assumption that there's kind of like the right amount of data basically given the parameter size in language models, and you're capped here at, you said 34 billion examples.
Yeah.
Right. So like, which is, I know it's not exactly the same modality as text, right, where we're talking usually in terms of tokens here, but in terms of language tokens, it's quite small, right? And so I'm wondering, like, if we imagine the kind of availability of text of this data that you have with text, do you think that this could change?
So I think this ends up being a problem of just how much data is there, right? And I think with data synthesis of images, that will change a lot. So maybe going much farther on this axis is possible in the realm of synthesized images. But as for natural images, it's just harder to scale on the same level as pure text. I'll also note that each image is like usually like, I don't know, like hundreds of tokens. So that's also one factor here. But even putting that aside, it's again, I'm not going to say it's not possible. It's definitely possible that at some point, like if you just scale in distribution, I'm saying in distribution, this might go down. If you have targeted data synthesis, this will go down much faster. But just blindly scaling, which honestly is what folks have been doing, doesn't seem to be the answer. Like right now we've got models that are like, oh, Quen 7 billion, Quen 32 billion, sorry, 13 billion, right? They don't tend to grow that much, even in parameter size. So, you know, that's just something to think about in terms of the difference.
And you are requiring paired data also for your training, right? Like
Yes.
it has to be captioned data.
Yes.
Okay. Is there a world in which you could just have images and just have text and you know have that work?
Well, okay. So a lot of the, I mean, this graph specifically is for contrastive models like CLIP. CLIP does not start with a pre-trained language model. It's trained from scratch. But if you look at like, I don't know, Quen, for example, Quen VL, that lifts a pre-trained language model, whether that's Vicuna or whatever. So that there is some like signal coming from pure text in there. And then you do this multimodal alignment, which is coming with this paired data. You also have some work that's like, oh, we're going to like have a really, really good vision encoder, but you do tend to see that vision encoders fit better in this multimodal scheme if they were trained from the ground up on paired data, rather than you train on vision for some time and then you like try to force it into this different regime of paired data.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have any other questions?
I guess maybe you have this in the next slides, but is the solution data augmentation of the samples to address these shortcomings for human labeling?
Kind of, and yes, I will get to that.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, so it's kind of the point of the slide is saying like, even though scaling really works for ImageNet, it doesn't seem to work as well for reasoning. And there's this kind of like inherent question of, again, this is for contrastive models, but there is this inherent question of, you know, is reasoning harder than recognition? And if you see enough pictures of, I don't know, like a donkey, you know that it's a donkey, it's good enough, but it's so much harder to capture this concept of under, right? Like under a table looks very different than underwater, but they're both under. So this, I mean, in our evaluation, we only look at like a very physical under, but it still targets this you know, difficulty in the task itself. Yeah, so you know, the human behaviors underlying reporting bias don't go away with scale. And in the context of this project, that's what I want you to take away from this slide, that, you know, if people don't like use prepositions in captions, they're not going to use it, whether you have like 2 billion or 5 billion data points. Like, yes, it will like go up a tiny bit, but if the rate of occurrence is so low, then you would really, really, really have to scale super aggressively to elicit this data naturally. Okay, because again, this is looking at Leon, which did not have like specific annotations, it's just scraped from the internet. Okay, that brings us to our follow-up question, which again was raised earlier. Can we solve this problem by giving clear instructions to annotators? Okay, now if you look at this table, which I showed you way early in this talk, I said that, oh, look, the occurrence is really low all across the board. But what effect does annotator instructions have on this, right? So Leon, for example, is again straight from the internet. You're just looking at like alt text pairs in HTML documents. And so there's no instructions, right? So what you see is that there's pretty much no occurrence of these kinds of things that we care about. For Coco, you do have instructions, and I'll go into what those are in a bit, but there's nothing reasoning specific. They just say, oh, you know, the sentence should be at least this many words long. Make sure you do this, make sure you don't do that, but nothing about reasoning. So yeah, you do have instructions, so things go up a little bit of like, you know, I am specifically trying to annotate this image, not just, you know, use alt text, which can also be used for like keyword matching and stuff like that. But there's nothing reasoning specific, so you don't get a lot of occurrences. For Lava and Malmo both, the instructions mention spatial and counting when asking annotators to annotate the image. So you get that, but nothing else. Okay. Like you don't get extra types of reasoning for free just because you mentioned one or two of them. But, you know, of course, these were with different sets of images that these, you know, data sets were collected. So our next step, and, you know, the final part of the paper, is a controlled study with Coco images and different sets of instructions from Coco, Lava, Pixmo, whatever. Pixmo is a data set used to train Malmo. So this gets back to the earlier question about, you know, is is it just that there are not a lot of, things worth counting in these images, right? Okay, so what we're going to do is this controlled study, right? Like I mentioned, which on one side gives you a set of instructions, and that either it's from Coco or it's from Malmo, or it's from Leon, or it's like something that we have written. And on the other side, you've got the same set of images. Okay. Now let's take a look at the instructions for Coco. You've got very basic instructions. Okay, you've got describe all the important parts. And then mostly it's like, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Okay, it's just describe all the important parts as your positive instruction. And then it's like, don't start sentences with there is. Don't describe unimportant details. Don't describe things that might have happened in the past. And this is something I want to highlight because it's exactly our temporal reasoning, right? Don't describe what a person might say. Don't give people proper names. Like don't say, specific names for specific people. So that's Coco, right? Next we have Lava, which gives you a little more instruction about what to do. It says describe the visual content of the image, including object types, counting, actions, locations, relative position. It says, okay, also include background objects, discussion about events, only say something if you're really sure, and then, about the length of the sentence. So here, of what we care about, you've got counts and you've got spatial reasoning here. Similarly, for Malmo, it asks in this kind of bullet point format. And again, what we care about here are objects and their counts and positions of the images. And then we have our instructions, which we write ourselves. And we ask specifically for counts, positions, what definitely happened before or after, and what is definitely not true about this image, because we do still want true facts. We do want true annotations, at least for this study. But yeah, that we're kind of specifically saying, okay, we want 1, 2, 3, 4. So the question is, are these things just difficult to elicit, or have we not been doing it correctly? Yeah, question?
Yeah, just curious about that prompt. What is definitely not true about this image? Because like, I think you're targeting like when a user asks like, this is not a black cat, right? And I feel like there's so many possibilities about negatives of it. So how would, I feel like that's still kind of hard to define even with this prompt. Like, I mean, it makes sense for a machine to generate that kind of output, but for a human, that's hard. Like we don't know ahead of time, like what some random user might ask.
Yeah.
For negatives.
This is not the Titanic also, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And it's kind of purposely underspecified, right? Now, I think there's an interesting question of how much data do you need to understand a given concept? And I would argue, I argued earlier that you need more data for spatial understanding than for recognition, like what is a donkey? But I would say that negation is like much farther along that line. Like you do need to understand like negation of attributes, negation of relations, negation of objects, right? Negation of the whole scene. So I think all of those are difficult. This is going to need a lot more data. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got these very different sets of annotator instructions. And one thing that I do want to mention here is that we want to capture people's tendency to speak briefly, right? It's a Gricean maximum of quantity. It governs so many of the hypotheses that I told you earlier of like, oh, people aren't going to like add all this extra information for no reason. So what we did is we said, okay, we want you to have at least 8 words. Okay, and I should also note, sorry, on that topic, that all of these instructions are lifted almost word for word from the existing benchmarks, except this one, which is the sentences should contain at least 8 words, which we got from Coco. But feel free to make it as long as you'd like to include the information requested in the instructions. So we are kind of targeting, remember that these are paid annotators, right? I heard someone mention Prolific earlier. We've used Prolific for this. We're going to tell them, you're going to get paid, how much ever, I don't remember the exact number per data point, but it's like $15 an hour on average. So, cut that down. Your amount that you're paid per annotation is fixed. That's what they think. So you have this tendency to be brief because obviously you want to maximize how much money you can make or minimize the amount of time per, amount earned. So that's kind of how we capture, people's brevity or tendency to be brief. And what we do afterward actually is like, okay, we've captured, that tendency. And now we actually go back and like post hoc pay these people after the whole study was concluded, saying that, oh, you spent so long, we don't want to underpay you, here's that extra delta. So we are paying them fairly while still kind of using this, set up to capture people's tendency to be brief. So that was something that I thought was fun. Okay, so what happens, right? This is the effect of annotated instructions on reporting bias. You've got your occurrence of all these different things. I calculated these myself because there's only 100 data points. And you've got COCO instructions, lava instructions, Pixmo instructions, and hours. What you see is that you get what you ask for very clearly. It's not that this is something that people have a really hard time talking about. It's just that we need to be better about instructing people to do what we want to do. And we really need to have this link very clearly in our heads that if we don't ask people to do stuff, first of all, they're not going to do it. But secondly, our models are probably not going to be able to do it. So that's the connection that we really want to push forward here, that if you want a capability in your models, you better be asking annotators to write that down for you. Okay, so lava and Pixmo ask for spatial encoding. You get spatial encoding. You don't get much of anything else. Our instructions ask for everything. You get everything. Temporal, like COCO, specifically says don't add anything about temporal. And yeah, you get like very low temporal occurrence here. So again, yes, these types of reasoning can be elicited from annotators. And in the paper, we've got a little like small scale fine-tuning study to show that the amount of data we surface with these annotation instructions is sufficient to learn the underlying task. Specifically, we look at counting. We've surfaced about 39% occurrence of counting, and we, kind of cobbled together this fine-tuning data set that has 39% occurrence of count. And we show that if we train on it, you actually do really well on the counting task. So it is enough just to ask people for counting. They will give you enough information to do well on the task. Obviously, the more, the better, but, this is still something. I will note that this fine-tuning study was actually recommended by a reviewer of our paper. And I didn't initially agree with it. They were like, oh, you should fine-tune to make sure it's not an architecture problem that's stopping you from being able to do this. Now, obviously, it's not an architectural problem because we know that models can do these types of things when trained specifically on these types of things. And doing a fine-tuning study isn't surprising. Like, of course, if you fine-tune on a distribution, you're going to do well on that distribution, or at least better than you would have without. Our proposal here was, hey, we're going to tell you how to instruct annotators. And we want people who are collecting data and pouring millions of dollars into collecting data to remember this so they collect better data. Our lab doesn't have the money to do that kind of study because really it's so expensive. But that was kind of our pitch that, hey, we don't care about fine tuning. We're only caring about pre-training. But what it did occur to us that, okay, we can kind of spin this and say, okay, maybe rather than just saying, can we do it? It's a question of, oh, are we surfacing enough data in this fine tuning regime? And it does look like we are. So that's just, a fun point about it is not only do people say it once you ask them to say things, they say it enough for you to learn the task. Okay, yeah, that's kind of everything that I wanted to talk about. So in summary, we're leveraging linguistics, pragmatics, and more to guess what's missing from captions. We find that we're right when it comes to web scale, open source image text corpora. Yes, these things are missing. And VLMs do indeed do poorly on the reasoning types related to the missing data. So like I said, if people don't caption it, we're not going to learn the reasoning task. Unlike perception, reasoning does not tend to emerge with scale, or if it does, it's extremely slow to the point that, it's not tractable anymore. However, you can elicit the missing information with careful annotator instructions. So this is kind of like, a shout to the community saying, hey, look, you've been scaling and scaling and scaling, consider the data quality. For all of these, huge labs that are spending millions of dollars on scaling and, scraping data, synthesizing data, make sure that the data is good, right? Yeah, so that's everything I wanted to talk about today. Thank you. Do we have any questions?
I guess, wait, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
So at a high level, right, the question that comes to my head is, why are we looking to captioning data to do this, right? We can look at captioning as a basic text to image mapping task, right? And potentially you can have annotations on top of that are image-based question answering annotation and stuff like that. And the analogy I'm going for is, when we pre-train language models on the internet, we don't really give them much specific supervision. I'm sure there are a lot of things that are missed or that are underreported on internet scale data. And perhaps that's also a problem with internet data. And if we could fix it there, we would. But it feels like after that, we don't expect just pre-training on the internet to give it reasoning capabilities. We go and do other like fine-tuning on task-specific data or giving it something more like that. So why do we want, like, why are we looking at captioning data as the route in which reasoning capabilities gets put into these models?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I probably should have made this clear earlier. When we evaluate the training data of Lava and Malmo, we're looking at all of it, not just the like image text pairs, but also these kind of question answer data sets. So Malmo, for example, is trained on, I don't know, like 20, 30 question answering data sets. And we looked at each and every single one of them. Like we, went through all of them to see, does this data set surface the stuff we're looking for? Does this data set surface the stuff we're looking for? And so actually, and I should mention this, for example, Pixmo, not Lava, Pixmo has, we have a little like asterisk in the paper here, because Pixmo has specific counting data. They've got a whole separate thing. They've got like this model that can point, and that's how they teach it to count. And they've got counting data. So this, like, you shouldn't really be looking at the counting number here for Malmo, because Pixmo has like a very different format. So what we do look at is the formats that we can, parse, which are the question answers and the captions, which by and large are what these models are trained on. Now, a separate thing I want to mention is that the question answering data sometimes can be synthetically generated. For example, Lava, it's got this nice question answering format, which is generated by GPT, I believe 3.5 or maybe 4.1. And if you actually look at that data, it's not great because the models aren't great, right? Like there's a chicken and egg problem of if GPT can't do left and right, then it's not going to be able to synthesize data for you correctly with left and right. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, makes sense.
I guess, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, yeah, just a very high level question. Do you have a more concrete sort of definition that differentiates between reasoning and recognition? Because I feel like the spatial reasoning that you've mentioned is sort of, for me at least, more of a perception problem as well. Like if you see that let's say I think it was the mug under the table example. So if you know that the mug is part of like the lower quartile of the image and then the table is above it, and if you can actually perceive that correctly, is that really reasoning? Is it like, does the model at least know that like the locations are all correctly placed? And then, yeah, I don't know if that question makes sense.
No, it definitely made sense. And this is a really good question, I think. And personally, like, the summer I've actually been interning with FAIR, and we've been looking at reasoning in the context of text to image models, and people have been dropping that word like left and right. I think it's really good to ask this question, first of all, of what is reasoning? How are you defining it? In this work, we're not defining, specifically reasoning, but you were asking about recognition, right? Here we're looking at recognition in the term, through the lens of ImageNet, because that's the one that had these nice like scaling laws. And ImageNet is just like classes, right? It's like, here's an image, it has exactly one object, you're focused on that one object. What is the object between like 1,000 options? So that's kind of what we're comparing against, that if you look at, and this is the kind of what I was hinting at earlier, that if you look at 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 images of a donkey, you'll be robust to different colors, you'll be robust to different lighting and so on, and you will know, okay, this is a donkey. It's much harder to say under. You were mentioning earlier that, if you look at the bounding boxes, you can get it, and that does work in this particular paper, but there are cases in which it doesn't work. For example, this is a good example. In the mug under the table example, right? There are papers that evaluate like spatial reasoning in terms of bounding boxes by saying we want, a gap between the two bounding boxes, and we want one bounding box to be under the other bounding box. So mug under the table wouldn't be caught there. Separately, if you do something like underwater, yeah, you're not going to be lucky there. They're kind of like, these there are varying definitions, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But we're trying to be consistent within this paper that recognition is like ImageNet style, and what we're doing is more complex than that.
Okay, makes sense. I mean, the context that I was asking this was because I recently had a MIME understanding video benchmark where me doing this motion is kind of obvious to humans that I'm swinging a bat, but not very much so for models. And analyzing the sort of chain of thought to try to see what the models are actually seeing when I do this, they actually are perceiving wrong, as in like the hands are not actually close together. They would like think it's close to the face or something like that. So I said that was a perception problem. But if we're thinking about like spatial orientation of where things are in relation to everything else, I guess we can argue that's also a spatial reasoning problem. So just wanted to ask your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think it's a threshold, to be honest. Like, and that threshold might depend from project to project. For what you said, I think it absolutely makes sense that there, like, you're thinking of it as a basic capability, and if that's messed up, then of course you're messing up downstream, and you can't blame the chain of thought. Whereas, you know, if it was correct, then yes, you can blame the chain of thought if something went wrong, and that's reasoning.
Thank you.
We have, yeah, thanks. We have a question online, I believe.
Muted, as always.
You're muted. You're muted. We can't hear you.
Typed it.
Yeah, maybe you can type out your question in the chat. I'll read it out.
Okay, now.
We have.
Oh yes,
yeah,
we
we
can
can
hear
hear
you
you
now.
now.
Yeah.
No, but I like well, anyway, you have to let you had the system muted. Anyway, I have a question about, so I'm not an expert on LLMs and so on, but it seems that you focus on this kind of human annotation. But it seems like for at least two of your categories, you can just do machine annotation. So for counting and for special relationships, you can probably train classifiers that will figure out the special relationships of the number of objects in these images. So you could probably get, I mean, whatever, as many annotations as you want, but perhaps not the same quality as the humans. So have you tried that, or are you planning to do that?
Yeah, so this is a very good question, and it comes back to this concept of data synthesis, right? Now, people more and more are leaning towards data synthesis in training these big models. Momo uses a little bit of synthesized data. Lava uses a little bit of synthesized data out of the four that we've studied. And again, you get this sort of chicken and egg problem, unfortunately, of even like, you know, wait, let me pull up that big table of GPT. Yeah, here it is. Okay, so today GPT-4o and o1 are doing really, really well on spatial reasoning. So you're right that we could use something like that to annotate this data and, you know, generate a lot of it. If you had looked back, like, you know, 1 year ago, 2 years ago, these models were not doing so well. You know,
maybe they did some of this. Maybe they do this automatic annotation themselves. I mean,
exactly. Because you can imagine doing this sort of thing, just as the question that was raised earlier, can you get at this information with bounding box detection and math on the coordinates, right? And there are some cases in which yes, you can. There are some cases in which no, you cannot. That's the examples that I was mentioning of mug under the table. So sometimes it can help, you know, by and large, you see that people are augmenting with synthesized data. So I agree that it's something that can be synthesized. I guess our question is, you know, if you're collecting data anyways from people, like what's a good way to do it? And further, if you are collecting information from a model, if I'm asking, for example, GPT to annotate this image for me, what should I ask GPT? Right? So the same way we're saying we need to be very careful with our instructions to annotators, that applies whether it's a human annotator or an automated annotator, like GPT, for example. And does that answer the question?
I think I guess you can do this. You can bootstrap other LLMs, but I was thinking more of just train a classifier. I mean, more in the lines of the previous. I mean, I know how to do that with a spatial and negation, I guess. Sorry, spatial and counting. Negation and temporal, that seems much harder. I don't know how you would do that, but anyway, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, so exactly, spatial and counting are the ones in which you see more prevalence in our existing pre-training data, because it's easy to, you know, relatively easier to kind of get those annotations.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm. Oh, hi.
Hey. Yeah, so my takeaway from this talk was that, like, if you want your model to have these like certain capabilities like spatial understanding, counting, whatever, you need to collect data by instructing annotators to like reveal these things specifically, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the same but like the same data that you get through these like more verbose instructions is used not only to pre-train these contrastive models, but also generative models. Not generative models as in like text to image, but more text plus image to text. Like, or just say like just image to text, like an image captioning model, for example.
Yeah.
Now, if you have these more detailed instructions that ask people to reveal things that they wouldn't have otherwise, then the distribution of data that you're going to get in your captions is going to be a little outside of like what a pragmatic captioner would have said, right? Like if the context of those specific instructions did not exist. But then if you train a captioning model on this more detailed data, you're now likely to end up with a model that doesn't follow human pragmatics anymore. Is that a reasonable claim to make?
Oh, sorry. So you're, let me make sure I understood you. You're saying that if we indeed instruct annotators with, the instructions that we came up with, yes, we get a lot of captions that do capture the kinds of information we're looking for, train a model on it. It now it is now capable of doing that reasoning, but may generate out of distribution captions. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a good point. I think the hope is that if the model has actually understood that type of reasoning, you can suppress it if needed. That, for example, if I now have a model after collecting this good quality data and training on this good quality data, I now have a model that understands negations and negations that I can say, hey, probably don't use negations and maybe it can stop. And even if you don't want to do it, I get that this point is kind of saying, you want to learn not only the concept of negations, but also when to use negations, right? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, basically you need to learn the pragmatics part that is kind of encoded by the human captions without this additional prompting. You're kind of losing that.
Yeah, that's a good
Then you
point.
would
But
have
I
to do like
think,
this additional step of training the pragmatics into the model.
yeah, I mean, the thing is, we're not telling you to throw away all of this data, right? All of this data that does encode all of this pragmatics, we still want you to train on it. We're saying, yeah, also add some like high quality quote unquote data that captures, the types of reasoning that you want your model to be able to reason over. So you can imagine that like it would be probably a small fraction of the data, enough for you to say, okay, most people caption in this certain way, but it seems that this is also another way of captioning things that taught me a lot, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to caption images in this way because it's maybe a small part of the distribution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but again, we need like some kind of change to the pre-training paradigm, or
Yeah, no, I agree with
like
you
kind of know
completely.
when to suppress what.
Yeah. Okay, I see we're a little over time. Do we have any other questions?
I
Okay,
think that the big room is muted and they're trying to say goodbye.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Yeah. I think that's it from us. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I look forward to the one-on-ones after this.
Yeah, I've sent you an email and you can just reply if about the schedule. Yeah. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.